Hi, and welcome back to the Lil Will Learning Company. So, over this weekend, I read a very interesting article, and it was about the state of New York and how New York just spent about $10 million to revamp their reading instruction across the entire state. And their plan was to spend that $10 million, basically, have many teachers go through professional development in order to implement their new instruction based upon the science of reading. And the science of reading basically just means phonics. And now, for years now, we've known about this science of reading. We know it basically becomes or comes from phonics, decoding, and structured literacy. But when you actually look at the training and the materials they have to present to these teachers so far, you still see a lot of elements of balanced literacy within it. You see a lot of guessing strategies. You see a lot of these cueing strategies and looking at context in order to cue the students. Bigger question behind this is, with all this known research about how best to teach students to read, why is it that a lot of places still cannot fully commit to phonics and decoding reading strategy? It's not even new research. We've actually known for decades the best way to teach students to read and the progression with which to teach them. And yet, a lot of these systems, they can't really seem to break away from that balanced literacy model. So let's take a look at what was promised in the state of New York. They basically said, we're going to go back to basics when it comes to reading instruction as a state. Now, what we mean by basics is a system that it's a very structured reading program. It's going to be phonics based, not guessing what a word says and not memorizing patterns randomly. Now, that means starting with decoding and then eventually turning that print into sound and then understanding how all of that works together, such as blending and all of that. It's essentially a phonics program. Once you have decoding down, then you start to go over fluency, then vocabulary, then reading comprehension. There's a progression with that. So that was the promise the state of New York essentially had mapped out. And really, what it comes down to, it really starts with the phonics program, as most reading instruction should. That progression's really important because if you don't have decoding down very well, the rest of the progression falls apart anyway. There is no fluency or learning vocabulary or reading comprehension if decoding is something that students struggle with. So on paper, New York looks like it's heading in the right direction. That's the promise it had made. And the problem ended up becoming their intention versus their implementation of what they're about to do, because they're not the same thing. Here's what's actually happening. They had many experts review the teaching materials that New York was going to use, and what they ended up finding was something that looked very, very familiar. In fact, they found that it still implemented a lot of the balanced literacy instruction that New York had been using up to that point. And by the way, not just New York, many, many places across the country were using balanced literacy. They were using strategies such as, well, here's this picture, and here's the context that the word is in, and essentially just guessing how to sound out this word based on what they saw. So it wasn't this clean shift away from that approach. If anything, they were trying to blend the two different instructions together, a decoding based instruction with a balanced literacy instruction. But the problem with using context and pictures and essentially a model where you kind of guess how to sound out the word, it's a direct contradiction to what phonics is teaching, to what decoding is teaching. In other words, they're not really learning the skill of how to decode and read this word. And by the way, that's those two different approaches. They do two different processes in the brain. Processing how to sound out a word and decoding it is much different from processing what this word might be based on looking at pictures and context. So instead of replacing ineffective methods, we're just layering two different methods on top of each other, and that's where things begin to fall apart. So why can't you just mix these two instructions together. Let's go a little bit more in depth about that. So, the part that not enough people say out loud is these two different types of instruction, they they're just not two styles that you can blend together. They're asking two very different things of students. So, science of reading is decoding based, but balanced literacy is like a meaning based guessing strategy. And one of them says, hey, sound this word out. The other is saying, hey, we've given you a lot of different clues and context and pictures. I think you can basically guess how to sound this word or what this word is. The issue with that is that when a student does guess correctly, it looks like reading, but in truth, the skill of reading was never actually built. And decoding is a skill that has to be practiced constantly and worked on. And if a student is guessing what words mean instead, then the skill of reading is not actually being built. Just because a student guesses correctly here, maybe for many more, again, that process of actually decoding is not being built upon. And the process is really important to build mastery, especially in the later grades. So when you mix these two approaches together, you don't get any balance at all, and the skill of reading is not built. And when the skill of reading is built up in this manner, you get very inconsistent readers. Well, if we know all this to be true, why does this keep happening? And it's a complex story behind it, but let's start with a few key things that would probably make sense. Number one, it's not because teachers don't care, and it's not because people are lazy. That's not the reason for it. Fact is, the balanced literacy approach is that many school districts and many people and now many teachers were trained in it. And because so many were trained in it, a lot of these curriculum companies built their entire curriculum based upon that approach. So you have billions of dollars tied in to this reading method. And now when they're being told at the state level, like, hey, we're going to go back to a science-based approach to reading, phonics, decoding, and all of that. But when you have the people who actually have to implement it still trained in the other approach, they're like, well, but we already have this, and a lot of our curriculum is already tied into this. Why don't we just blend them together? And there's a lot of momentum behind that, a lot of money tied up in that. That's not the full answer, but it's a big reason why there's a very concerted struggle to pull away from balanced literacy and fully commit to a full phonics based approach or science of reading based approach. When you try to keep a little bit of both systems, you basically build a very shaky foundation of reading instruction. Like I said earlier, if the skill of reading is not built, everything falls apart later. And then you get these massive gaps in reading ability from student to student because one student does have the process of reading down. They can decode words, whereas the other is still guessing. And that compounds over time. It gets worse over time. And especially in a subject or basically a skill like reading, that gap in skill starts to show up really fast. So the problem with students who look like they're reading and the truth is that they can't really decode, but it looks like they're reading and they're, let's just say, really good at guessing, especially for the early grades of like kindergarten, first, second, maybe even third grade. The problem is by the time you get to third, fourth, and fifth grade, those students begin to hit a wall because you start to get more complex vocabulary and more complex reading material that you need to rely upon decoding for more difficult words. And guessing starts to become a very ineffective reading tool or reading strategy, whatever you want to call it. It's just not as effective as decoding is. What's worse about it is that gap in reading skill, you'll start to get students in fifth grade, let's say, who are reading at a first or second grade level, maybe a third grade level. But then you'll have the other end of the class where you have students who can read in middle school level material, maybe even some who can read at a high school level. And it's because those skills in reading weren't addressed early on. And the sad truth is, those students who are reading at a first, second level, they would have benefited the most from just clear reading instruction that dealt with teaching decoding very early on, right from the beginning. And the sad thing is, now they have 2, 3 years later, and the gap in their reading skill is significant compared to the other students in the classroom. And so that's why I want to point out, none of this is theoretical. It's very predictable. It not only is reading more difficult in the beginning, it becomes increasingly more difficult with age and the older grades as it's allowed to continue on. The takeaway from all of this is that having clear and structured reading instruction is very important. It cannot be a compromise. It cannot be a blend of two very different styles of instruction. The reading instruction works best when it is structured and it's intentional in what it's trying to teach. Reading is a progression. Every single skill builds upon the last one. And so when you have a clear progression of decoding, then fluency, then vocabulary, then reading comprehension, that's how good readers are built. Because when it comes to reading, there are no shortcuts. Well, I hope that was helpful. And hopefully, for the state of New York, hopefully it works out well for them. But I guess time will tell. And thanks for tuning in. Please like and subscribe to the Lil Will Learning Company. And if you need materials for phonics, math, reading fluency, spelling, come check us out. We have all the materials that you will need for your child's educational journey. And until next time, take care.